an empire of salt. For centuries, the Romans ruled the Western world, and from the beginning, salt was a key to their power. Roman cities were often founded near salt works, and one of the great Roman roads, the Via Salaria, or Salt Road, was originally built to bring salt to Rome from the nearby salt works at Ostia. The Romans believed that everyone had a right to salt. Common salt was served in a simple seashell in most households or in an ornate silver bowl at a wealthy family's feast. Unlike the Chinese emperors, the Roman rulers did not try to own all the salt but only to control the price. To make people happy, Roman leaders tried to keep prices low. Salt was occasionally taxed to raise money for armies, but sometimes Emperor Augustus distributed free salt when he wanted to gain public support for a war. Words salted by the Romans. Many English words are based on the Roman word for salt, sol, even the word salt itself. Sol is the root of the words salary and soldier because Roman soldiers were often paid in salt. This is also the origin of the expressions worth his salt and to earn his salt. Salad, too, comes from ensalada, a salt word because Romans ate their greens with a dressing based on salt water. Salt was central to everyday life in the Roman Empire. All along the Mediterranean Sea, Romans produced three highly valued salt products: fish sauce, purple dye, and salt fish. Many kinds of fish were cured in salt, dried, and sold throughout the Western world. A slightly rotten sauce. Would you put a sauce made from fish guts on your food? The Romans made a sauce called garum by placing leftover fish scraps, the innards, the gills, and the tails, in earthen jars with salt until they fermented into a fishy-smelling liquid. The Romans used garum like the Chinese used soy sauce. It was added to food instead of salt. But not everyone loved garum. The naturalist Pliny said that it was rotten, and the philosopher Seneca called it an expensive liquid of bad fish. The smell of purple. According to legend, purple dye was discovered when Hercules took his sheepdog for a walk along the sea. When the dog bit into a small shellfish called a murex, his mouth turned a strange dark color. The Romans learned how to produce this purple dye, but it was an extremely expensive process, and only wealthy people and royalty could afford it. Julius Caesar decreed that only he and his household could wear purple trimmed togas, and the sails of Cleopatra's ship were dyed purple. The only problem was that the purple liquid stank. It smelled so bad that when a 19th century chemist identified the purple element, it was named bromine, a word meaning stench. The New Sea. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean Sea remained the center of Europe's salt trade. Two small Italian cities, Venice and Genoa, fought for centuries to control Mediterranean salt. In 1380, Venice defeated Genoa and remained dominant for a century. But then something happened. At the time, Venetian merchants like Marco Polo would have to travel huge distances overland, eating lots of salted food along the way to get valuable silk and spices from Asia. But in 1488, a Portuguese sea captain named Bartholomew Dias found a faster and cheaper way to get those precious goods. He sailed from Portugal around the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. With Dias' journey, the great age of exploration had begun. Nations on the Atlantic Ocean, such as Portugal, Spain, France, Holland, and England, suddenly saw a chance to shift power from the Mediterranean Sea to their Atlantic ports. They sent out explorers like Christopher Columbus and John Cabot to the New World and greatly expanded world trade in furs and codfish, both of which had to be salted for shipping. By the 16th century, northern countries like England, Holland, and those in Scandinavia were catching more and more fish for a hungry European market. In fact, from the 16th to the 18th century, 60% of all the fish eaten in Europe was codfish, while much of the remaining 40% was herring. All this fish needed to be cured with salt, both for taste and so that it could travel across Europe. But there was a problem. Salt was harder to get than fish. Only southern Europe had enough sun and dry weather to make the sea salt that was ideal for salting fish. And so, alliances were made and trade organizations formed between the countries with the fish and the countries with the salt. The English made a treaty with the Portuguese, and many northern countries bought salt from a German trade organization known as the Hanseatic League. Preserving justice. The Egyptians were not the last people to preserve their dead with salt. In the 1600s, conditions in French prisons were so bad that many prisoners died before they could be brought to trial. So they were preserved in salt and kept until their court date. One famous story was that of Maurice Lacour. He had died in prison and his body was preserved in salt. But French justice could be notoriously slow. After 7 years, poor Monsieur Lacour still had no trial date. Finally, the case was dropped and Monsieur Lacour was buried. Salt and liberté. Even as the salt trade became more international, rulers still used salt to raise money in their own countries. In France, King Louis XIV raised the taxes on salt for many of his subjects. Soon enough, people began smuggling salt illegally to avoid the tax. It was smuggled across rivers at night, hidden in shipments of salt fish, and even concealed by women in their dresses. An entire branch of police was formed to stop salt smugglers, and by the late 18th century, 3,000 French men, women, and children were arrested every year for salt-related crimes. Some were even sentenced to death. The ship of state. The royal tables of France were set with huge ornate salt dispensers called nefs. Nef is an old French word for ship, and these model ships were made with precious metals. The nef was always placed on the table near the king since it was also a symbol of the ship of state. To the French, the salt and the nef symbolized preservation and good health, and that the stability of the state depended on the health of the king. The nef also sometimes contained a small drawer for an antidote to poison, helping the king to stay healthy in more ways than one. North America's shortcomings. Before the European colonists came, the Americas followed the same pattern as other continents. The Aztecs in Mexico, the Mayans in Central America, the Incas in Peru, and the Chibcha in Colombia were all dominant civilizations who controlled the salt trade. When they lost their power, they also lost control of the salt. When the British arrived in North America, they tried to control the salt trade too. In 1607, Captain John Smith established the colony of Jamestown in Virginia and started a salt work. In 1660, the Dutch started a salt work for their colony of New Amsterdam by granting the right to make salt on a small island nearby, today known as Coney Island. New Englanders were becoming wealthy trading cod and furs, while Virginia's hams were becoming famous. However, most of the salt the colonists used was bought from other British colonies in the Caribbean or directly from England's main salt work in Liverpool. When America declared its independence from England, their salt supply was suddenly cut off. George Washington's army lacked salt to make gunpowder, to preserve food for marches, to maintain horses, or to heal wounds. Immediately, the Continental Congress had to start paying a reward to colonists to establish salt works, and soon America had its own salt supply.